I keep forgetting to tell people, the readings that we're using throughout Lent, particularly the third, fourth, and fifth Sundays of Lent, are taken from year A. So if you're following us in your missalettes, you'll notice that there's year B readings, but then after that there are the year A readings. And we use those because we have the scrutinies for our elect and our RCIA. So I apologize for that if you were confused about where to find those in your missalettes. So today we are, again, moving through these last words of Christ as we are throughout Lent. And we come now to this fourth phrase. We kind of rearranged the third and the fourth phrase. So today we're looking at, again, this cry of Jesus from the cross. Prior to this, particularly the first couple of phrases, Jesus comes across perhaps as a bit more strong or regal. He's able to forgive people of their sins. He's offering humanity his mother Mary. There's this generosity. But now, particularly last week and today, it's almost as if now he's descending even further into this darkness, into this weakness, into this powerlessness. This experience, this total experience of being crucified, of losing everything. And particularly today, in that phrase that he cries from the cross, what could be more dramatic? My God, why have you forsaken me? And so Jesus then is addressing this primary relationship that he has, that he lives from, this relationship he has with the Father. Like Jesus, well, like all of us, we are made to live in relationship. That's who we are as human beings. That's in the very design of who we are as men and women. If you go right back to the first pages of Genesis, when Adam was first created, he couldn't really find meaning and purpose in his life until he met Eve, until he found that companionship. Then he said, aha, at last, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. We are made for relationship. And, last week Victor talked about how being made in the image and likeness of God, that relationship that we are called to live in must reflect the very relationship that God himself lives in. And Victor gave that beautiful kind of description of the Father, giving everything over to the Son in total love. The Son receiving everything the Father gives him, and then gives it back to the Father. And from that is born the Holy Spirit. And so we're called to live in the relationships, not just relationships, but relationships of love. And we see, again, Jesus extending that from the cross as he gives us Mary, giving her to us to accompany us, to sort of flesh out, if you will, that life that we're called to live in relationship. And when we're not living in those right relationships with God and with one another, it creates all kinds of tension, and perhaps even worse, causes havoc and disorientation and tremendous sadness and pain in our life. There are all kinds of manifestations of human suffering, and we see it again. Jesus experienced all of that on the cross in terms of the physical pain he would have experienced of being scourged, of had crowns of thorns on his head, nailed to the cross, and so on. But I think today we're being called to examine not just that physical suffering, but that spiritual suffering that he experiences. That suffering he experiences from feeling abandoned, of being alienated, of being separate from the Father. And Jesus' whole identity is one that is lived from the Father. He says, the Father and I are one. When he was baptized, he had again that whole experience of the Father being pleased with him, of choosing him, of loving him. And now he's at this point of desolation. And this then is often the desolation that we experience. This is the ultimate, human suffering. Yes, we have toothaches and headaches and backaches, but I think perhaps our heartache is the hardest to deal with, and it's perhaps it causes the greatest wounds in us. Because again, we as human beings, we are made for relationship. And we see this in the gospel today, in this man who was born blind. He suffers not only from blindness and not being able to see, but the way in which people treat him, particularly the religious authorities. They talk about him being born in sin. Sin is that state of alienation from God. They've kind of, labeled him and given him this identified him in this state of tremendous suffering. So what does Jesus do about this? Yes, he heals this man of his physical blindness, but there's something more that's happening. I think that speaks again to how Jesus wants us he saves us from our sin and suffering. In that sense of our heartache. Because this man, again, being blind and being identified as being born in sin has become isolated from that community. And so Jesus resolves this by taking up mud, spitting on it, and placing it on his eyes. I don't know about you, but when I read that, it sounds a bit repulsive. I don't know if I'd want someone spitting on mud and placing that on my eyes. It's not the way I typically think of healing happening or the relief of suffering. If you think of hospitals and how, cleanliness is everything, sterility, sterilizing, antiseptics, and so on. And yet this is Jesus's way, this is Jesus's antidote for this physical suffering that this man experiences. And ultimately, this man then regains his sight. But more than his physical sight, he starts to see Jesus for who he is. He is the Son of God. He is the Christ. More than a prophet, he is the Messiah. And he truly comes to see Jesus for who he is. And in that recognition, that last line says that he worshiped him. He adored him. So he came into that right relationship. He was no longer alienated. He was no longer separated in that state of sin. He was fully in that right relationship with God. And I think in a sense, that's what the cross is. That's what this cry of Jesus is from this cross. His own personal experience of being alienated, of being identified with sin, of being identified with that separation from God. He does it from that state of messiness. He wasn't very clean hanging from the cross. There was mud all over him, I'm sure, from having fallen down 3 times. Blood all over him from being scourged and nailed. Sweat from the physical exertion of what he underwent. It wasn't a very clean sight. It was quite muddy. And in a sense, that mud that's being placed as a salve on the eyes of this blind man, the cross and the cry from Jesus from the cross is in a sense the salve that Jesus places on the whole wound of humanity. This state of being alienated from God. It's very messy. So that's how, in a sense, Jesus then takes the muddiness of that experience, the pain of that experience, and turns it into something beautiful. It turns it into something by which we become healed. This is the great mystery of the cross. And Jesus spares nothing in giving that to us, the antidote to sin, the antidote from being alienated. And he does that by completely identifying with us in that state. So, Jesus being the second person of the Holy Trinity, of being the Son of God, allows himself to experience that total sense of alienation. That horrible, repulsive, muddy sense of being separated from God. My God, why have you abandoned me? And mysteriously from that place then, Jesus then becomes totally united with us. In whatever state we find ourselves in when we are separated, when we are alienated from each other and from God. This is the great gift then that Jesus offers us. This is the great salve. This is the great healing that God offers us so mysteriously from his own suffering, from his own alienation. This is the great paradox of our faith. And so as we celebrate this Eucharist today on this fourth Sunday of Lent, as we look forward now to the nearness of the Paschal mystery, of entering into Jesus' passion, his death, and his resurrection, let us have the courage and the grace to continue to walk and to be with Jesus in these moments, these mysterious but very powerful moments that in many senses, according to the eyes of the world, is very repulsive and unattractive, to say the least. But if we stay there and reflect and contemplate and be with Jesus in these moments, then we start to be healed. Then we start to experience what that man experienced in the gospel. And we're able to more fully worship God, adore him, and love each other.